because some people say things like, I never want my dog to bark. Well, then rehome him to a good home and get a cat.
But speaking of like being in the yards and territory and fences, so we have another question here from Dana. She's got a 3-month-old puppy who does a lot of barking and trying to get to people and other dogs that walk by the yard. And he's overexcited and overwhelmed. But when he does greet, he kind of panics. So he'll bark as they walk by. And she doesn't want the barking reinforced as the thing that makes the people walk away. And then the puppy works for his food. He's a Bohemian Shepherd. I don't know what that is, but I have all kinds of really cool images in my mind right now of a Bohemian Shepherd.
He's like this traveling gypsy type shepherd.
Yeah. Beads in his hair and I've never heard of that one. There's so many. I'm not a breed guy, so don't take offense to that. I generally don't pay much attention.
It looks like a Travern mixed with a Shepherd.
So, yeah, really young dog here, and sometimes that changes things, right? When we're dealing with a 3-month-old puppy versus an adult dog, and then also on the property versus out on a walk. So, I mean, yeah, what do you have to say for somebody who's got a 3-month-old puppy that's already starting to show these things? Obviously, we don't want to just let them go unchecked, but we also want to be sensitive to the dog's age.
Yeah, and to their breed. I say this a lot to people is like, you bought a Shepherd. Like the dog's going to be a lot barkier than if you got one of those. That's not a lump. It's kind of a lump. It's the black lab. So you have a Shepherd. It is genetically programmed to be barking at things when they go by. Some people in the comments are going to be like, I've got a Shepherd that never barks. Congratulations. That happens too. There are labs that never stop barking as well. So we got to be sensitive to the fact that like, this is the kind of dog you bought. He's young. And it doesn't mean that there's nothing to do. It doesn't throw in the towel. It just means be aware and be sensitive to the fact that this is a dog, because some people say things like, I never want my dog to bark. Well, then rehome him to a good home and get a cat. Like, come on, you got a dog. That's like saying, I don't know, whatever. There's no analogy needed here. So being sensitive to the fact that it's a dog, he's young, he's excited. Food, exercise, and training are it's always a combination for me. So what are you feeding them? Because the more processed food that goes into their body, they get this sugar high that comes out. So adding in natural foods to balance out, natural fats to balance out those sugars. One, how much exercise is he getting? He's only 3 months old. You don't want to overdo it on things like concrete and cement, or like jumping off of things where he's developing, but grass is pretty safe to tucker him out. And then in terms of training, you might be in an age and a stage where you can really get his attention because they're so food motivated when they're young, that, like you said, getting him to work for his food and then setting up the behavior is one of the things that we all need to do more of, right? It's like, I need to put some time aside to call some friends to go, can you come by and not walk by when my dog starts, not keep going, or actually come in when he calms down. So that way the dog is getting rewarded for that behavior. So, you really have 4 options. Do I correct it? Ooh, he's a puppy. If you're going to correct it, you might use something gentle like a spritz bottle, can work really well. You can redirect. You could avoid it by not having him out in that front part, especially during busy times, but that'll come back to bite you probably. And then you can ignore it. You could have him just barking his head off, which you don't want. Otherwise, you wouldn't ask the question. But you always have those 4 options: ignore, avoid, redirect, and correct. So I wouldn't be opposed to a little bit of spritz of water to be like, hey, I actually don't want that. And then when the dog stops and gives you attention, balancing that out. The redirect, I would just keep his attention with the food. And when after the person walks by, what a lot of people do with food is someone's coming, the dog starts barking, you redirect the food, feed the dog, and then the person hasn't gone by. So then the dog starts losing it again. So rather than holding and baiting the dog, so like having the food and like, oh, here's the food, oh, here's the food, oh, here's the food, to keep their attention, because it's that anticipation is better for the dog. There's more dopamine released in the anticipation than actually receiving the treat. So those are my thoughts. What about you? What do you got?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I think that thinking about what is our long-term goal here is super important too, because again, like you mentioned, it's a shepherd. And if it is like a front yard or a corner yard where it's unavoidably the dog's going to be in the yard and see people walking by, like, is our goal that the dog doesn't ever bark at people walking by? And that might be a really tricky goal to achieve. Or are we more concerned with just the socialization of the dog? And is this barking at people going by sort of a red flag towards a deeper problem, perhaps, that like, I don't want my dog to grow up thinking that people are bad and that it barks at people and they go away, and that this leads to other things, that eventually when people come in the yard, the dog either is trying to nip at them or is fearful of them or whatever. So because it like in the question, that's a little bit unclear. And so I think, definitely it's really worth taking the time and working on that socialization piece. So getting enough of that exposure, so it's not just this constant practice of like early signs of territorialism, but just making sure that we are getting enough socialization so that even if the dog's gonna bark, that it generally doesn't think that people are awful. It's just barking because it's what it does. But if you invite somebody into the yard, it's not a major problem. And so prioritizing that as, again, like a training thing, just like we talked earlier about prioritizing going in and out of the kennel. It's like, maybe for this dog right now, sure, it would be nice to spend time working on sit or spend time working on down, but maybe we just need to spend time working on, hey, what do we expect from you when somebody enters the yard or when we enter the yard with somebody else? And just making sure we get the reps of that in, because I think that's the biggest problem with this is when we just wait for it to occur, like we just put the dog in the yard, we wait for somebody to walk by. You kind of have one shot to get it right with any one person walking by, and then they're gone. Yeah. Whereas if we have a friend do it and the dog doesn't get it right the first time, we say, okay, like walk away, like wait a minute, let's try this again. And we can get some reps in, and we can teach our dog, and we can give that little spritz of water if they do the wrong thing, give that reward when they do the right thing. And then especially once they start doing it right, and this is so huge, and I talk about this all the time, and this is really big anytime we're using any kind of correction, is the tendency is like, okay, let's say we're going to have somebody approach the gate. The person approaches, the dog starts barking, we spritz him with water. We go, okay, walk away, let's try it again. Person approaches, dog barks, we spritz him with water. Okay, walk away. We do that 2-3 times. Maybe on the 4th time, the person walks up and the dog doesn't bark, and we give some treats. And then a lot of times we immediately go, okay, what's next then? So maybe now the person's going to come all the way in the yard, or now I'm going to have them walk up faster, and I'm going to have them walk up and bang on the gate. And we never just give the dog a chance to practice doing it the right way over and over and over and over again, and get really confident in what decisions avoid the correction or avoid the punishment, what decisions lead to treats, and that this whole event doesn't have to be stressful or, make them feel uncertain or anything else. So getting those reps in before we sort of move to the next step, and just letting the dog practice doing it the right way, to me it's so big, and it's so often overlooked. And especially with a young pup, let the dog get really confident. Okay, this choice led to this, but this other choice leads to good things. And 1 rep of that, 2 reps of that isn't enough to solidify that knowledge. Get a dozen reps of that in before you try to move on to something else. I think is super, super important. So
remember